Let's first examine Joseph. Well, we know out of jealousy that Joseph was sold by his brothers to Midianite merchants, who then sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Then, after being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into prison, Joseph interprets the Pharaoh's dream about the upcoming 7-year famine. For correctly interpreting his dream about the upcoming 7-year famine, Pharaoh gives Joseph extraordinary power. We read here from Genesis 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And he called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Interestingly, a stela, known today as the famine stela, was discovered on the island of Sahal in the Nile River that describes a terrible 7-year famine in vivid detail. It reads, "I was in mourning on my throne. Those of the palace were in grief. My heart was in great affliction because happy had failed to come in time in a period of 7 years. Grain was scant. Kernels were dried up. Scarce was every kind of food. Every man robbed his twin. Those who entered did not go. Children cried. Youngsters fell. The heart of the old were grieving. Legs drawn up, they hugged the ground. Their arms clasped about them. Couriers were needy. Temples were shut. Shrines covered with dust. Everyone was in distress." An interesting piece of archaeology that may connect. Well, Pharaoh Sesostris I in the 12th dynasty receives credit for ushering in an era of prosperity in the country and is known to have given extraordinary power to a viceroy by the name of Mentuhotep. And many scholars argue that he should be identified as the biblical Joseph. To bow down to a viceroy was atypical at best, but entirely consistent with the kind of power given to Joseph by the Pharaoh. Egyptologist Emil Berg describes Mentuhotep in his book, Egypt Under the Pharaohs. He said, in a word, our Mentuhotep appears as the alter ego of the king. When he arrived, the great personages bowed down before him at the outer door of the royal palace. Well, immigration into Egypt from Syria and Canaan aligns well with the biblical narrative during Joseph's reign. This relief was discovered in the tomb of an Egyptian governor during the 4th year of Sesostris II and records an actual event in which a group of 37 Semites paid tariffs, that is, custom duties, to a monarch's official. The leader of the caravan is named Abushai, a distinctly Hebrew name. It was, for example, the name of a top general under King David. But what is most remarkable about the rendering is the depiction of advanced tools and instruments that were introduced to Egypt by the group. You see evidence of metalsmithing in as one of the technologies brought, as indicated by the anvil and billows loaded on the backs of the donkeys. The recurved laminated bow is also being carried by members of the group, a more advanced bow than was known to Egypt at the time. You also see a 12-string harp, and some intricately woven fabrics were worn by both the men and women of the group. Well, a remarkable discovery was made during excavations at the location of the city of Ramses in the land of Goshen. Archaeologists uncovered a settlement that existed several centuries earlier called Avaris. Avaris initially developed in the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty as a town of Asiatics, that is, Semites from the area of Syria and Canaan, that was apparently allowed by the Egyptians since there were no fortifications built around it. The culture of the population was found to match the Canaan-Syria area in multiple ways, such as the architecture, the pottery, and burial positions used by the settlers. The site also fits the Bible's Exodus account because it quickly grew to become one of the largest cities in the world of its day. A Syrian-style house was discovered to have been built at Avaris, which was later demolished, and a palace was constructed in its place. It has been suggested that this house and the palace that I will show you next was erected for Joseph, belonged to Joseph of the Bible. The palace that you see here was later built on the site in an Egyptian style, but it belonged to a Semitic official. This fits the rewarding of Joseph by Pharaoh in return for saving Egypt from the ravages of the 7-year famine. Pharaoh raised him to second in command over Egypt and gave him other rewards. The construction of a palace has been dated to either late in the 12th dynasty or early in the 13th. Interestingly, the palace was found to have 12 pillars at its entrance. They also found 12 primary graves behind it, built with memorial chapels. These fit the 12 sons of Jacob, who was also named Israel, who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. The primary tomb that was found at this palace is believed to have belonged to the Semitic official, was in the shape of a pyramid, something unique at this time for a foreigner, but again fitting well the great rewards and honor given by the Pharaoh to Joseph. Inside this pyramid-shaped tomb was positioned a statue. This is a remake of that statue, and it has all the motifs designating a Semitic official from the Canaan area, along with a coat of many colors, very interestingly. The official that owned this home is consistent with the description we have in the Bible of Joseph and the type of power he acquired in Egypt. A very interesting discovery, to be sure. Well, next, I want to bring another interesting archaeological discovery to your attention that may have either been built by or was named in honor of the biblical Joseph, what is known as the Bar Yosef, which means the Waterway of Joseph. The discovery was made by an American engineer named Francis Cope Whitehouse, who was retained by the British to resolve the problem of increasing lands suitable for farming in the desert wastelands of Egypt. Whitehouse became intrigued with a small freshwater lake in the midst of the vast Sahara Desert that had no visible water source. From the lake, he followed the traces of a canal and discovered that it connected to even a larger canal that paralleled the Nile for several hundred kilometers. A summary of Whitehouse's discovery is provided by Kerensky in his book, The Eighth Day, The Hidden History of the Jewish Contribution to Civilization. Kerensky says, around the lake's perimeter, as well as at a considerable distance from its shores, Whitehouse came across the ruins of ancient dams, ditches, aqueducts, and a variety of structures that mutely testified to the existence of a vast and sophisticated irrigation system. Ancient fish, bones, and other signs scattered about the sand surrounding the oasis unmistakably demonstrated that the lake had once been many times its current size. That yet another lake had existed that had since dried up, and that canal system that fed into and out of the lakes had extended the arable land far beyond its contemporary boundaries. Whitehouse found references from even more ancient historians to the artificial lake, which was already ancient in their time. For example, Herodotus, the Greek historian who lived in the 5th century BC and is regarded today as the father of history, stated this: the water of the lake does not come out of the ground, which is here extremely dry, but is introduced by a canal from the Nile. White House likewise reported that the Egyptians did not regard the canal as an ordinary waterway, but reverently referred to it as the Bar Yosef, which means, again, the Waterway of Joseph. His research led him to the conclusion that the problem of desert irrigation had been addressed more than 3 millennia ago. Convinced that the solution to Egypt's water needs was the reconstruction of the ancient canal system, White House fervently presented his proposal in April 1883 to the Godival Geographic Society in Cairo. In June, he pressed his case before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and thereafter in a series of lectures and pamphlets, but he was ignored. Others, however, finally came to appreciate the value of the ancient system and to recommend its reconstruction. The entire irrigation system was eventually reconstructed without crediting White House for his research. The modern-day Joseph's Canal now supplies water to 2 million people who live in the Fayum and the vast farmlands of the region. Here is a closer view of the canal. You see the Nile River runs over there on the right. Joseph's Canal runs there on the left, where it then banks off to the west, connecting that canal system to the Fayum. The canal system in Egypt, referred to as Joseph's Canal, is a modern-day reconstruction of an ancient system possibly built by Joseph of the Bible. Legends, both Judaic and Arabic, have it that Joseph, the viceroy to Pharaoh Hyksos II of the 12th dynasty, was responsible for this monumental contribution to the lasting welfare of Egypt. And the legend has a factual foundation because we know that under Israelite rule, such vast projects were indeed carried out in Egypt during the times of the famine. Interesting, right? Had you ever heard of Joseph's Canal? I think it's pretty cool stuff, man. Yeah. Well, we also want to place Moses and the Exodus into the Egyptian timeline. Now, again, many argue that it took place in the 18th and 19th dynasties during the New Kingdom period, but this is much too late. We do not see evidence for large numbers of slaves out in the 18th and 19th dynasty, or a sharp decline in Egyptian dominance as we would expect following the plagues and the Exodus and destruction of their army, and the destruction of Jericho does not match this period either. We'll be reviewing the archaeology of Jericho as well. Many have used these conflicts to argue that the Bible's historical record is not true. But when the histories are correctly aligned, we find remarkable agreement. Well, another problem for aligning the biblical and Egyptian chronologies is the questionable length of time the Israelites were sojourning in Egypt. Was it 430 years, what is referred to as the long sojourn, or was it 250 years, what is called the short sojourn? So this is an ongoing debate called the short versus long sojourn. How long were the Israelites in Egypt, 430 or 250 years? 215. The only Old Testament passage to suggest a long sojourn is Exodus 12, 40 to 41, which reads, Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. This is from the Masoretic text. However, the Samaritan Pentateuch and Greek Septuagint read Egypt and Canaan. So they lived in Egypt and Canaan 400 years. And it also adds, and their fathers to the sons of Israel. Since Israel was in Canaan for 215 years, from Abraham to Jacob, that leaves 250 years in Egypt, from Jacob to Moses. Another verse central to the debate is Galatians 3:16 to 17. Here it is argued that the Apostle Paul is stating that from the promises spoken to Abraham to the giving of the Mosaic law, the total lapse time is 430 years. Here again in Galatians 3. Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but rather to one. And to your seed, that is, Christ. What I'm saying is this: the law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. Again, since Israel was in Canaan 215 years, from Abraham to Jacob, that leaves 250 years to be in Egypt. I'm not an expert on this, but I just leave that with you, whether you hold to a short or long. To be honest, I've looked into it pretty significantly, and as not being an archaeologist or an expert on Egypt, basically I look to the experts and try my best to summarize what they're saying. And looking into it, well, I see a sharp divide. You know, about half of them seem to be short, half of them seem to be long. But if one is favored over the other, I believe it's the short sojourn. More of the scholars that I've looked into seem to hold to that position than the long, but there's a debate about that as well that causes some troubles here. Well, there are records of substantial slavery populations during the reign of the last rulers of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris III, and Amenemhet III, and Sojourn, Amenemhet's daughter, were in reign during this period. These are the sad ruins of what remains of the pyramid and magnificent mortuary temple built by slaves under Amenemhet III at the Havara out in the Fayum. The mortuary temple and this pyramid formed a complex that was world-renowned. Its many columned courtyards and chambers and passages caused it to be known in antiquity by travelers as the Labyrinth. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of it this. He said, "I have seen this building, and it is beyond my power to describe it. It must have cost more in labor and money than all the walls and public works of the Greeks put together. Though no one would deny that the temples of Ephesus and Samos are remarkable buildings, the pyramids too are astonishing structures, each one of them equal to many of the most ambitious works of the Greeks, but the labyrinth surpasses them." This must have been something else. Well, here notice that a close-up shows the sun-dried mud bricks of the pyramid of Amenemhet III, again at Havara. Now, mud bricks with straw were used to make this pyramid, which supports the biblical account of the Israelites making bricks with mud and straw. Here we read from Exodus 5. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people, saying, "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." Some believe that Amenemhet IV should be identified as the Moses of the biblical Exodus. Amenemhet IV was a pharaoh of Egypt who served as a junior co-regent under Amenemhet III. Now, there are no records of Amenemhet III having any sons, and thus Amenemhet IV's ancestry is enigmatic. Furthermore, he mysteriously disappeared before the death of Amenemhet III, resulting in Sojourn, one of Amenemhet III's daughters, ascending to the throne and becoming Egypt's first female ruler, something that's very interesting. In addition, Amenemhet III had two daughters, one named Sojourn, who was, again, the first female ruler of Egypt. Sojourn is often listed as Amenemhet IV's sister and also his wife, and it may have been her who found Moses on the Nile River. It is known that she had no children, which may explain why Amenemhet III was willing to accept Moses as heir to the throne. But when Moses came to age and identified himself with the people of Israel and was forced to flee, this left a vacuum on the throne. And when Amenemhet III died, there was no male successor. Therefore, Sojourn ascended the throne and ruled for 4 years as Pharaoh. But when she died, The dynasty died along with her and was succeeded by the 13th dynasty. So who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Let's read here from Exodus 12. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go and also bless me." He asks them to bless him before he leaves. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. Quote, otherwise, they said, "We will all die." The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. Well, Neferhotep I, shown here of the 13th dynasty, may have been the Pharaoh from whom Moses demanded Israel's release. Interestingly, his mummy has never been found, unlike that of Ramses II and Amenhotep II of the 18th dynasty, who is also frequently claimed to be perhaps a pharaoh ruling at the time of the Exodus by the standard Egyptian chronology. Both of their mummies are in the Cairo Museum rather than the bottom of the Red Sea where they should be. Remember in Exodus 14, the ruler is specifically stated as being with the pursuing Egyptians. We read, "When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, 'What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services.' So he and his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, and with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord." And the text says, not one of them survived. Here from Exodus 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Also, in Psalms 136, 13 through 15 says, "To him who divided the Red Sea asunder and brought Israel into the midst of it, but swept Pharaoh and his army into the Red Sea." And again, Neferhotep I's mummy has never been found. Those supporting a pharaoh whose tomb has been point to the following passage, which states that the Israelites saw the Egyptians lying on the shore as a support that the pharaoh could have been found on the shore and buried. It says, "But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground and a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore." So some argue that maybe they found Pharaoh lying dead on the shore and took him and mummified him. But army officials in particular would have been heavy loaded with armor. And Pharaoh certainly would have been. It's not something you're likely to be able to survive, being covered by a sea of that magnitude, covered by armor. Don't think you'd have swam your way out of that. Well, Kahun is an ancient Egyptian worker village that is located in the modern village of El Lahun in Fayum. It was built during the construction of a pyramid of Sesostris II and was occupied during the 13th dynasty. Biblical archaeologists such as David Down and Bryant Wood have concluded that Kahun was occupied by Israelite slaves that were laboring in Egypt. Scarabs of former kings were found at Kahun. For example, Neferhotep being the last king to have been found there. This indicates he was apparently the Pharaoh ruling when the Israelite slaves suddenly left Kahun and fled Egypt in the Exodus. The site was originally excavated by Flinders Petrie between 1888 and 1890, and again he did further digs in 1914. Along with household items and tools that provided a good representation of life during the 13th dynasty, Petrie also found the Kahun papyri, which discussed medical and mathematical topics and is best known for the insights it gives into the use of Egyptian fractions. David Rosalie wrote a book about Petrie's discoveries wherein he states this: "It is apparent that the completion of the king's pyramid was not the reason why Kahun's inhabitants eventually deserted the town, abandoning their tools and other possessions in the shops and houses." He continues, "There are different opinions of how this period of occupation at Kahun drew to a close. The quantity, range, and type of articles of everyday use which were left behind in the houses may indeed suggest that the departure was sudden and unpremeditated. Kahun seems to have been abandoned without premeditation during the 13th dynasty, which some have presented as evidence of a mass exodus of Israelites from Egypt. Tools and household possessions were found at the site, indicating that the town was deserted suddenly. Another event that is noteworthy in connecting the Exodus with Egyptian history is a mysterious takeover of Egypt by what are known as the Hyksos, who took over without a battle. The historian Manetho, who composed a history of Egypt for the Library of Alexandria, you may remember, in the 3rd century BC, states this: "Men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country and with ease subdue it by force, yet without our hazarding a battle with them." So the Hyksos have puzzled scholars and for years, and multiple theories abound as to who they were. The word Hyksos simply means rulers of foreign lands. How this group managed to take over without a battle is mysterious. Or from the biblical account, it seems rather simple. Egypt, remember, was severely weakened by the events leading up to the Exodus, and their army was at the bottom of the Red Sea. It would make it pretty easy for some foreign rulers to come in and take over, which appears to be what happened. So, Neferhotep fits pretty well as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. His mummy has never been found. His was the last scarab found at the abandoned Semitic village of Kahun. Plus, he was not succeeded by his son, likely because his son died in the plague. A few years after Neferhotep's death, the 13th dynasty came to an end, and the Hyksos took over without a battle, and which began the second intermediate period. Some scholars have identified the Hyksos with the Amalekites, who attacked the Israelites fleeing from Egypt. It is plausible, at least, that the Amalekites flowed into Egypt without resistance because of God's decimation of that nation.